Welcome back to the ASI Pill, where the exponential goes all the way down. Today, the regulatory endgame, China at escape velocity, and billions of AI persons. Swallow it.
Yeah, 5.6 Sol is roughly comparable to Mythos preview. If you look at all of the cyber benchmarks and some of the bio benchmarks, it's roughly comparable. It wins some, loses some. But I think the bigger story here is we're in the regulatory endgame. This is exactly during the founding early days of OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic. There was an enormous amount of hand-wringing over what would happen when we reached the era of recursive self-improvement and the race condition that would happen. And there was a general consensus that the frontier labs would all establish some sort of coordination mechanism with each other to slow down and sort of cross the finish line together without creating a race condition. And many people at the time said, oh, this was impossible. There's no way, there's no possible way. This is sort of the paradox of Moloch, Molochian economics. I think Scott Alexander would say would mean we're permanently stuck in this social trap of everyone competing against each other. It turns out the same old coordination mechanism that we've had for thousands of years, government, localized geographic monopoly on force, is more than capable, it appears, of being that coordination mechanism for getting the final two, at least as of this point in time, the duopoly of frontier labs, OpenAI and Anthropic, to synchronize the release of their capabilities out to the first few dozen customers or users that the government is going to gatekeep. So in terms of the raw performance, roughly comparable. And I think what's even more interesting than the fact that 5.6 Sol is head and shoulders in terms of cyber capabilities and other capabilities, also efficiency versus 5.5, is that basically the government, the US government, has functioned as a synchronization mechanism for helping 5.6 Sol reach essentially some form of parity or near parity with Mythos/Mythos Preview 5. That's extraordinary. We've never seen any sort of third party basically forcing the two leading contenders who would otherwise be in a race against each other to essentially similar capabilities. And yet that's what we're seeing. And at the same time, looking at China, the Chinese open weight capabilities, there's this chart floating around X extrapolating the time difference between Chinese open weight models reaching the same capability as the two remaining frontier Western open weight models. And if you extrapolate it, depending on how you calculate that time delta, the number is on a trajectory to go to zero by Christmas of this year.
Everyone keeps throwing around the word harness like we all agreed on what it means. So what is it really, and why did it quietly become the whole game outside the model?
Well, so a harness typically refers to non-weight capability improvements. So when you're building a machine learning model, there are many phases. It typically consists of a neural network of some sort. The neural network is composed of weights. The neural network has some intrinsic behavior. It goes through pre-training, mid-training, post-training. These all impact the weights directly. Now you have a model and you want to, on the fly, change its behavior. So in the beginning, in 2020, when we first got GPT-2 and large language models or few-shot learners, there was the prompt. You could change its behavior in context by feeding it different text as a prompt. And the output was versatile and it was good. Then people realized...
It's a biblical statement, and it was good.
And it was good. And then people realized maybe we want to factor out common elements of that prompt across many prompts. And the system prompt was born, and it was good. And then people realized that it was desirable to keep factoring out common elements and logic and text and other information out from all of these prompts into what ultimately became a harness. So it's now quite possible, as Emad mentioned, as many others, including myself, do, to create lots of what Andrei Karpathy might call software 1.0 harnesses that live outside the model, that orchestrate the models, that feed common system prompts and other prompts to the models, that parse the outputs, that mix different sorts of models from different vendors in order to achieve super performance. That's what a harness is.
If the real capabilities are racing ahead inside the labs while everyone outside stays frozen at parity, what does that do to us? Is there suddenly a reason to go work at OpenAI just to get behind the curtain?
Well, it looks like protectionism. It superficially, it looks like protectionism may be masquerading as export control. And there is, I think, a very real risk that the U.S. falls behind. I think without this regulatory regime, we were neck and neck, maybe 6 to 8 months ahead of the Chinese models. And now there is very much the risk that AGI is achieved internally, but externally for all of the users, the users are American users and Western users of American frontier models are stuck at parity or worse, behind parity with Chinese models, whereas internally within the labs, the capabilities are continuing to leap ahead. And that sort of distinction, we speak of the singularity all the time. In a black hole, there's the notion of an event horizon as being distinct, as having distinct outer horizon versus inner horizon versus singularity maybe at the center. And there's very, I think, real risk that the frontier labs, at the moment, the 2 American frontier labs will have internal capabilities that vastly outstrip what is available to everyone else. And that, as a number of folks, including Rune from OpenAI and others have mentioned, creates the risk then, it creates some sort of weird, perverse incentives for the American economy. Like, for example, are we incentivized to all go work for OpenAI and Anthropic so that we gain access to the internal capabilities?
Well, that's happening already.
And if this hardens into 2 blocks, what happens to everyone caught in between? Where does that leave Europe?
Got to be right.
Well, it's like Pax Silica. One could imagine the Pax Silica generalizes to the Pax Intelligentsia, where you have the American superintelligence block and you have the Chinese superintelligence block, and Europe is torn between them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why.
Here is the uncomfortable one. Has China already reached the point where it can bootstrap its own recursive self-improvement without stealing a single thing from the West?
I think we're in the end game. I think China has enough capabilities at this point to achieve its own recursive self-improvement, its own Fermi pile, if you will, without needing to further siphon trade secrets or reasoning traces from Western models or just literally trying to exfiltrate weights out of frontier labs. I think we're in the end game. That this policy could only possibly make sense if we are in the end game of recursive self-improvement and every day matters. I think the steel manning of, well, this is regulatory overreach or maybe not overreach, but a regulatory immunoresponse, say, to Mythos or to GPT-5.6 being able to do incredible vulnerability analysis and mapping and exploitation. I think that justification only holds water, only supports itself if we move on, hopefully, to a lighter touch regulatory regime, say in a month or 2, that maybe is a little bit, as Dave says, more focused on recursive self-improvement gatekeeping and less on vulnerabilities. But otherwise, I think China has reached recursive self-improvement escape velocity at this point on its own and doesn't need the West's help.
Interesting.
So take us home on this. If we believe in a strong immigration policy for human talent, what happens the day we start importing more foreign intelligence that is artificial than human?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, Sputnik was a moment of strategic surprise when the U.S. was surprised by the USSR. The surprise came from outside, not from within. This time around, this is a Sputnik moment, and the surprise came from within. The NSA and Cyber Command were surprised by the private sector. The private sector leapfrogged the vulnerability and other cyber capabilities that the NSA had been keeping bottled up. And that has to be a bit of a shock to the existing bureaucracy, because now suddenly there are these capabilities that are leapfrogging the government from the private sector. That's thought one. I would say more broadly, though, the problem with recursive self-improvement is eventually the capabilities of the non-human intelligence, the AIs, meet and exceed human-level intelligence. I'll say something mildly provocative, which is, if you think that that the U.S. should have a strong immigration policy for human immigration, human capital into the U.S., then arguably, as the capabilities of AI start to meet and exceed human intelligence, you'd better be thinking about policies for what happens as you import foreign AI as well. At some point, the US will be importing more foreign, if this open source trend continues and Chinese capabilities ultimately meet or leapfrog US frontier capabilities, the US will be importing more foreign artificial intelligence than more foreign human intelligence. And I think that has profound policy implications.
What if we just bulk solved every security hole in open source? All of it as a public works project for the AI age? And are the labs quietly shipping models that sabotage you the moment you turn them toward offense?
Well, first, Daybreak, this is what, Peter, you and I wrote about in Solve Everything. We are seeing cyber vulnerabilities in open source and closed source projects get bulk solved now by AI. There are a few different nonprofit initiatives, one being run by IBM. There are a few others that are competing, solely devoted to just using these new capabilities to bulk identify and remediate vulnerabilities and bugs across all the open source projects. So I think this becomes a sort of great project of the times, like the interstate highway system, except going back through the historic record of all of these open source repos, especially the foundational ones that are in the supply chain of really popular downstream applications. So go after of everything, just bulk solve it all now that we have the capability to bulk solve it. On the narrower point of GPT leapfrogging on CyberGym, I think we're going to see, again, internally only, or with a limited staged release, leapfrogging of capabilities in terms of the ability to detect and remediate vulnerabilities and bugs. We're seeing for the first time Sam talking about intentionally biasing the models toward defense versus offense. And he never used the word poison in characterizing this, and OpenAI never used poisoning attacks, which is perhaps maybe a slightly less inflammatory characterization than Anthropic's original release announcement with Fable and Mythos. But reading between the lines, it certainly sounds like OpenAI is steering their models to basically self-disrupt or poison their users if their users are trying to use their frontier models for offensive cyber versus defensive cyber. They're reading between the lines. That's what they were implying. And I think that's the world we're going to find ourselves in, where alignment comes in the form of a model together with scaffolding, system prompting, post-training that favors the defender and favors the desired outcomes, and then obfuscates, foils, poisons, attacker-type use cases.
So why is OpenAI suddenly racing to become Anthropic? And what would it actually take, the revenue rabbits, the accounting, maybe even an AI in the CEO chair, to justify $1 trillion IPO?
Yeah, I agree with Dave's points. I would also say OpenAI screwed up. They focused too early on the consumer, assuming that the consumer would be the source of the revenue engine that would power their path to an IPO. And that bet was probably incorrect. They should have focused on enterprise. They're now trying to become Anthropic faster than Anthropic can become OpenAI. That seems to be working. Codex is a wonderful product, and Codex revenue, according to OpenAI's reports, is skyrocketing. So if I were Sam and I were OpenAI, or maybe I were just Sarah Fryer, I would be asking the question, how long until Codex can be fully brain swapped in with all of ChatGPT and powering the revenue engine that I need to motivate the $1 trillion plus IPO? With Elon and SpaceX, he pulled a few rabbits out of his hat at the last second, announcing Anthropic hosting deals and then hyperscaler hosting deals with a number of other firms. With OpenAI, ideally, they'd have a few revenue rabbits that they can pull out of their hat in order to supercharge an IPO. And my impression is they're not there yet. It could take the form, to Dave's point, of an AI replacing Sam as CEO, and maybe the capabilities aren't there yet. My bet is, though, it's mostly a revenue story and an accounting story to make sure that they're profitable and not just burning cash. And I would assume, not investment advice, that they will get there sometime in the next year, but it's going to take some time.
This next one genuinely rewired how I think about my own skull. What if the human hippocampus is basically a transformer embedding space, which would make telepathy the easy part?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One, if Neuralink does do this, this will be one of the first sort of open attempts to create superhuman capabilities, not just restore capabilities from humans with a variety of, say, motor disabilities to the mean, but rather to empower people with superhuman capabilities. That's the first thought. Second thought is the latent space is particularly interesting. So there was a paper in Cell, I think sometime in the past week, I wrote about it in my newsletter, finding that people, children, adults who speak multiple languages, so bilingual adults, there was an open question in neuroscience whether if you speak the word for the same term in two different languages, whether there was a single bridge neuron that was responsible for activating for those two different concepts. And the answer turns out to be pretty surprisingly, I'm actually kind of surprised this wasn't published in Science or Nature. No, but the answer turned out to be that the spacing, the relative spacing,
the geometry. I read the paper. It's incredible. It's just like the AI models.
It's just like the AI models.
Yes.
That the hippocampus of the humans, bilingual humans, turns out to look more or less like a vector embedding space for an encoder-only transformer model. That is a shocking conclusion.
It was shocking. The neuron for pedo and dog are adjacent to each other. And that's what gives them that collocation. Amazing.
So if our hippocampus is basically just an encoder-only transformer embedding space, that would suggest that A, telepathy is going to be a lot easier than one might otherwise suspect. B, maybe human cognitive capabilities are actually not that complicated. And maybe we are just, as I've mentioned on the pod previously, just distorted reflections of our ancestral environment and the complexities in that environment. C, Neuralink is pretty invasive. I mean, I know it's packaged up as being less invasive than some of the alternatives, but it's still pretty invasive. You need to stick a needle, multiple needles inside a human skull. But if this embedding theory of cell placement in the human brain turns out to generalize, I would expect this will create enormous demand, and Emad, you of all people probably would have some view on this. I've chatted over the years with some of your former neuro employees. This will create, I think, enormous demand for non-invasive human-to-human telepathy, not just the invasive Neuralink type. And I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up becoming a hugely popular feature or product. Elon may be steering Neuralink in the direction in parallel of less invasive, non-invasive BCIs.
Let us change orbits. Literally. Can we map the entire star everything empire that Elon is quietly assembling, brand by brand?
Some of these, Peter, if I might just comment on this, some of these names we haven't even, I think materially, if you go back one slide, we haven't even materially talked about much on this pod. So to talk about,
you want to hit him? Hit him real quick.
Yeah. So Starlink, everyone knows that's space communication. Probably going to launch, if you believe the rumors, going to launch a direct-to-cell mobile service.
By the way,
soon.
Rumors that he's got to deal with Charter coming up. Actually, it was reported in Bloomberg that he's going to have a deal with Charter, and rumors that he might buy T-Mobile. That'd be pretty cool. Yep.
So Starship, everyone knows, propulsive landing and enormous heavy lift capabilities for everyone else in the economy. Starbase, Texas. Star Factory at Starbase producing starships. Starshield, program for the U.S. government to supply basically I want to say privatized, but a government defense grade version of Starlink for the U.S. Department of War. Starfall, just announced in the past few days. So this is a cargo deployment solution where private companies, and this was very, I would say, probably intentionally poorly marketed, have the ability to launch cargo up to LEO and then do a retrieval of the cargo. So
it only gets stranger from there. Orbital breweries and AI Dyson swarm with a brand name and a rocket company moving into oil and gas. So why would SpaceX ever need a pipeline?
And I mean, there are companies, Outpost among them, Varda among them, that are doing quite a bit of orbital manufacturing. They're most prominently, I guess, in my mind, Starfall example, there was an orbital brewing company that launched yeast into orbit on Starfall, retrieved it, and they're going to be now brewing orbital beer or LEO brewed beer.
What does that cost for a pint?
But it's been to space. Stargaze takes advantage of the fact that Elon and SpaceX now have all of these satellites that can look up and can look down, and provides situational awareness looking up and looking down, both in orbit and on the ground. Could end up given that we just had the conversation with Planet, could possibly end up becoming a Planet competitor. We'll see. Starmind is the brand name for the AI orbital constellation, the Dyson Swarm brand from SpaceX, if you will. And then Starpipe, which was only announced 2 days ago. This is incredible. Starpipe is, I think, Elon's, or really SpaceX's, nascent oil and gas play. So Starpipe is the beginnings of SpaceX's, I would say, refinery attempts to pipe natural gas around, given that the SpaceX's the propulsion is largely focused on methox. So piping methane around, piping natural gas around. They have no experience really in any refinery capabilities, but Starbase is in Texas. Texas has a lot of oil wells. Starpipe is this pipe that was just announced 2 days ago to start piping these capabilities around. And really, if you're going to build the first Martian colony or the first serious lunar colony, you need to have oil and gas capabilities and you need refining capabilities. So Starpipe appears to be the very beginning of SpaceX getting into oil and gas.
Why is China running away with video generation while the West barely shows up to the race? Is it the data, the money, or just where the revenue is not?
China's running away with video generation, unfortunately. So if you look at what the American competition looks like, what do we have? We have Gemini Omni, which is still limited to about 10 seconds. We have Grok. At least Elon is trying to give the Chinese a bit of a run for their money. But in China, and if you're training a video model, you have probably cheaper access to data that, by the way, as last time we discussed, I think at the Seedance 2.0 launch, if you're in China and you're one of these Chinese frontier labs, you're probably not too worried about being sued for copyright infringement for all of the TikTok or other similar video data you're using for pre-training these models. So you basically have far cheaper data, far less encumbered, at least in practice, training data. And also, the American frontier labs are all busy chasing each other's tails to build recursively self-improving code-gen models that are ridiculously revenue generating. If you ask, how revenue generating are these video models? Probably no comparison per token or per flop. I would guess code-gen vastly more lucrative and more economically productive than video. Who's going to be generating long videos? It'll probably be consumers who don't have that much money anyway. So for a variety of reasons, economic, practical, legal, we find ourselves in a world where China is running away with the video race for the moment until the West can come up with a compelling enterprise, a lucrative, productive enterprise use case for video generation, at which point I would expect and hope the Western labs to finally re-enter the race seriously.
Yeah. Maybe consumer video was always the wrong prize. What if the real money is an AI that can sit in your video call live and take part? And that market is $30 trillion.
I think there's like a $30 trillion market, which is enterprise software. So I totally agree that video games are a larger market than Hollywood feature films, but there's a market that's orders of magnitude larger than video games, and that's enterprise use cases. I don't know if you guys saw just again in the past few days, Alibaba's One Streamer demo. This is real-time, interactive, generative discussion, video to video. Like the three of you, or I guess more probably, I could be an AI right now. The three of you are real, and we're just having this discussion, and you could create a generative environment for me, and I could put my hand in the video or take it out. So there's, to Emad's point, there's some sort of minimal world modeling going on there that exists now, and it's real time, and it's interactive, and it's video to video. So if the West can stand up an enterprise real time, say like Zoom participant or FaceTime participant that can participate in company meetings, can be interacting in real time with audio and video, not just the live audio models, I think that starts to move us to a $30 trillion market versus just a $1 trillion market.
Here is a delicious irony. Anthropic was sued for hoovering up copyrighted books, and now it is accusing Alibaba of stealing its outputs. So is China harvesting our reasoning traces through proxies as we speak?
Well, first I have to point out the irony that Anthropic itself has been the target of multiple suits arguing that it took copyrighted material and maybe not using the term distillation, which is usually reserved for model-to-model training versus corpus-to-model training or pre-training. But I would say the shoe is ironically on the other foot. Anthropic sued multiple times for using improperly copyrighted books and other media for pre-training its own models. Now Anthropic is turning around and accusing Alibaba for using Anthropic outputs to post-train Alibaba's own models. Similar concept nonetheless. I do think that in the broader scheme of things, the export control regime and the regulatory regime that we were discussing earlier is in some sense a protectionist and protection for the U.S. frontier models and their vendors to prevent their insights from leaking out via what's been widely reported. If you're in China, in many cases, is public reporting. You have access via proxies that are in China or in friendly countries to access Anthropic and OpenAI and other strong Western models at a tenth the cost, 90% discount. So you pay a lot less, you get access to the models via these proxies. The reason for it is the proxies reportedly are gathering all of the reasoning traces. You agree to give up any notion of privacy in the reasoning traces. The proxies gather those reasoning traces using you basically as a sock puppet. And now those proxies can be used in principle for distillation or other efforts. I think it's an interesting question that I'm certain is going to be heavily litigated, whether distillation constitutes espionage or not. It's almost certainly a violation of the terms of service for Anthropic's models, but whether it constitutes espionage, I think will be probably a heavily litigated question, and probably yet another reason that the world seems to be on a path, sort of a second Cold War type path, where there's a US bloc and a Chinese bloc, and it's not just model access that doesn't flow, it's also reasoning traces that could be used to enhance capabilities that also seemingly don't want to flow.
Everyone assumes superintelligence makes patents worthless, that AI will just route around any claim. But what if it supercharges the defense instead, and intellectual property comes back stronger than it has ever been?
Alex?
I'll sound maybe just a different note here, which is I think there are striking parallels between the defense versus offense divide on software vulnerabilities and defense versus offense on IP litigation and IP protection. So one might say superficially, oh yes, sure, IP is over because AI will, for any patent, be able to find a way to route around it. That's the AI will overwhelm via offense argument. But at the same time, AI can also strengthen defense. AI can draft better patent claims. AI can do a better job of, say, patent litigation than humans will at some point in the near-term future. So it's not 100% obvious to me that call it the Astro argument, that IP suddenly evaporates because intelligence becomes stronger. I think intelligence, there are a variety of reasons, as we're seeing, quite frankly, with this export control regime, why superintelligence may want to protect itself via IP legal mechanisms. And if that is the case, I would fully expect the defense side or offense, depending on your perspective, side to be also supercharged with superintelligence, and not 100% obvious to me that IP goes away. In fact, it might just be utterly supercharged in terms of its ability to protect.
Washington just went all in on quantum with a stack of executive orders. But after all the hype and all the IPOs, has quantum computing actually delivered any science that classical AI did not reach first?
Mildly excited, not very excited. On the one hand, I want to quip that the forthcoming U.S. sovereign wealth fund will have an amazing exposure to all of these quantum stocks. One of the executive orders, so there were a couple of executive orders that dealt with it, but the more interesting one established that or rather required the development of what's called the quantum computer for application development and discovery science, QC-ADS, which is interesting. The first executive order I've read that mandates the establishment of a quantum computer for discovery science. So on the face of it, great. We want to accelerate science radically. On the other hand, I do think this may be a case of begging the question somewhat. There is already a vibrant private sector of quantum applications, not just quantum computing, also quantum networking, and most interesting to me, quantum sensing. So establishing a national quantum computer effort for discovery science, to me, reminds me a little bit of Genesis mission, which if you look beneath the covers at where the money's coming from, it seems to be a repackaging of existing U.S. government funding. So that part I find less interesting. What's more interesting to me is the protection from foreign threats. So until the executive order, I, for example, was not aware, I'd be curious to hear, were you aware that there's a quantum information science and technology counterintelligence protection team?
Nope.
We have that. Nope. We have a quantum protection team in this country. I think that's super interesting, and in some ways evokes for me this idea that the U.S. government was caught flat-footed by AI. The defense community in particular and intelligence community flat-footed. We saw, as we were discussing earlier, we saw Mythos and now GPT-5.6 leapfrogging whatever internal, apparently, capabilities the NSA has when it comes to cyber. In quantum, I think the thinking somewhere in the executive is not to be surprised a second time and to actually get out ahead of any quantum capabilities that might be strategically disruptive. The problem, as I've mentioned on the pod in the past, is quantum for science acceleration just hasn't worked that well. Quantum computing was supposed to give us protein folding. Turns out protein folding problem was solved by, arguably, AlphaFold 3 purely classically without use of any quantum computing. There are a lot of folks, including Peter, common friends, who were very aggressively marketing quantum computing specifically for solving all of these problems.
Well, could an AI discover the genuinely useful quantum algorithm that humans never could? The one that finally pays back all that investment? And why is a Dyson swarm starting to look less like a dream and more like the default?
So I think I have to jump in on this one. I think there's a latent assumption in this scenario that we see some sort of complexity hierarchy collapse. Right now, one of the reasons why quantum computers arguably haven't been that useful is because it's actually really difficult for humans without superintelligence to identify algorithms that are both economically useful and also achieve some sort of quantum advantage. We found a number of quantum advantaged algorithms. They're not that useful, at least not economically transformatively useful.
But they make for good headlines.
They make for wonderful headlines and amazing IPOs. To Emad's point, I think, and this is something that I'm bullish on, that I do think there's a pretty good chance that if there is some sort of, out there in math theory space, if there is an AI discoverable quantum advantaged AI training or inference algorithm, AI will find it, and that will suddenly pay back all of the sins of money being invested too much in quantum infrastructure previously, will atone for it. But separately, the point of the Dyson swarm, I would say the reason why I think right now we're on a default trajectory of a Dyson swarm isn't necessarily because everything is so efficient, but rather because we're running out of headroom in Moore's law. And as we start to, on the one hand, lose room at the bottom, as Feynman would say, and on the other hand, see skyrocketing demand for AI, and on the third hand, municipalities don't want data centers, we push them to orbit. Will quantum obviate the need for a Dyson swarm? I think they're probably not mutually exclusive. I could imagine scenarios where we build a Dyson swarm of hybrid or pure state quantum computers, and people don't want quantum computer data centers in their backyard, just like they don't want classical computers.
If this really is 1939 all over again, what is the actual goal here? Maybe not a permanent lead, just enough of one to dominate the entire future light cone.
Yeah, I think the right analogy there, so I agree. The right analogy is again something like we're in 1939 or 1940, and the goal isn't to infinitely or rather indefinitely preserve an American advantage in these capabilities. It's just to slow the rest of the world, namely China, down enough that we can hit enough recursive self-improvement and dominate, for whatever definition you prefer of dominate, the future light cone with capabilities that really only need to be a few months, at most a year, ahead of the competition.
And what exactly did Elon just quietly buy for a few $1 billion that could run 1,000 times faster than electrons?
I will note that, again, in the news in the past 2 days, Elon/SpaceX just acquired for several $1 billion a photonic computing/communication company to merge in. So would not at all be surprised if photonics, which gives us in principle 1,000x clock rate speed up over these stupidly slow electrons, becomes a key part of the Starlink or Starmind plan.
Well, so
way,
Google filed a
that,
patent.
Let us switch over to biology. A lizard protein turned Eli Lilly into a $1 trillion giant. So what happens when they run that exact same playbook on human sleep itself?
I think this is potentially as transformative as the GLP-1 receptor agonists. This is Eli Lilly seemingly playing the same playbook over again. So just to refresh, the GLP-1 RAs initially approved for treatment of diabetes, and taking advantage of this protein that was discovered, I think, in like lizards in Arizona.
Yes. It was oh god, what are the large
like Gila monsters or something?
No. Anyway,
reptiles in Arizona that could survive without eating for long periods of time, and were somehow able to maintain sugar/insulin balances for long periods of time. Discovered that actually if humans have an analog of that, it seems relatively well conserved. And if you can synthesize a receptor agonist, you can trigger common pathways and enable humans to balance their sugar levels over long periods of time. But it turns out the pathway is so important that it and this is still something I think of mystery science right now on the GLP-1 RA side. You're able to have all of these amazing, potentially lifespan increasing effects.
You're right. Yeah. Gemini says it was in the Gila monster. Yes.
The Gila monster, monster. So now same playbook, and I should add, like, the GLP-1 RAs took Eli Lilly and have made it a terracorn. Is it like $1 trillion company? And the revenue that it's generating off of just this is comparable to, if not larger than, all the token revenue that OpenAI and Anthropic are generating on similar timescales. So if you're Eli Lilly, you have to be asking yourself, can you take this receptor agonist playbook and apply it to other domains? And it looks like Eli Lilly thinks the answer is yes. And they're going to apply it to neuroscience next, where the role of diabetes is going to be played by narcolepsy. The role of GLP-1s is going to be played by orexins. And the role of health span in inducing positive side effects across all of these other areas is going to potentially apply to the ability to sleep less without the nasty side effects that you were mentioning, Peter, to help people who suffer from daytime sleepiness due to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and mood disorders, potentially helping people emerge from comas, because orexin is so essential to all of these neurological pathways.
Yeah. Do the math on this one with me. What would it unleash for the whole economy if everyone, everywhere, suddenly had 4 more hours of waking life?
Think of one more point. Think of all of the economic output that could be unleashed if everyone, everywhere had 4 more hours of wakefulness.
Yes,
and compare that. Yeah.
An audience question, and the answer goes somewhere wild. Could Argentina become home to billions of AI persons, companies with no human inside them at all?
So I'll take question number 2, which I think was aimed at me. Will companies migrate to friendlier jurisdictions like Argentina to escape U.S. AI restrictions? Wouldn't this erode trust in any model that can be banned? And this is from Evraninank. So I don't think model companies are at all likely to migrate to Argentina. I think the frontier model companies are going to very likely remain firmly entrenched here in the US, and you'll see Chinese companies firmly entrenched in China, and then there will be the rest of the world. I don't think Argentina is likely to end up hosting any frontier model companies. Companies that I can conceive migrating to Argentina under its proposed new non-human AI corporation regime will be inference time companies that are basically AI persons. So a humanless AI company that's just operating its own business. I can totally see many millions, billions of those types of non-human AI companies migrating to Argentina. That said, I would think, given the export controls that we've just been talking about on this episode, I would imagine many of them will probably end up running on Chinese models, unless the U.S. acts to restrict the ability of Argentina, say, to import Chinese models, which could, by the way, happen. We've seen under a variety of non-AI technology regimes, we've seen this executive act to restrict other countries that are neither in the Chinese bloc nor, strictly speaking, in the U.S. bloc, restrict their ability to import Chinese technology or Chinese commodities. So I can imagine a scenario where the U.S. acts to restrict Argentina's ability to import cheap or operate cheap Chinese base models, which would obviously foul up that approach.
All righty. Dave.
Why would you build your data center on the moon instead of in orbit? Something about security, raw mass, and very casually disassembling the moon for parts.
I would say they're complementary, but the cislunar environment certainly has a number of advantages that orbit does not. For example, if you're concerned about the security of your data centers, there are, and both the West and the East, the great powers have demonstrated the ability to, on orbit, send robotic devices in and with grappling arms. China, especially in the past year, has very publicly demonstrated this, interfere with on-orbit devices. Whereas if you have a data center sitting on the lunar surface, you can defend it. You can be sure that there's no one, for example, coming in behind you, listening to the same beam that you're using to communicate with the Earth on. So there are a few reasons from a security perspective. Also, the moon has mass. If we set up, as I think Elon and hopefully others are going to do, an industrial ecology that's non-terrestrial, you can start mining water and other elements. Water is not an element, obviously, but mining raw materials from the lunar surface to build more data centers. You can't build more data centers in orbit. You just don't have the feedstock to do that.
I was just going to say lunar regolith for folks, that's what you call the lunar soil, is silicon, oxygen, nickel, and iron. It's perfect for data centers.
Perfect for disassembling the moon, in other words.
Yeah, there's another version of that, which is highly likely, where you're using those elements and then you're using a mass driver to launch them into low Earth orbit. Yeah. That is something that's definitely going to happen because it's on the planning radar already. So
and it's the ultimate high ground. I mean, one of the narratives for why have an Apollo program at all was that it was a continuation of the Manhattan Project, and with the moon as the ultimate high ground for launching weapons. Well, it may be the case that in addition, perhaps, to the moon being the ultimate high ground for launching weapons against Earth, it's the ultimate high ground for launching data centers to service Earth.
Then comes the big one. A century from now, what do we even look like? Uploads in a quantum cloud, beings of near pure energy, living right beside people unchanged from today.
I think I have to choose number 6. Okay. So what physical and behavioral forms will humans and other species take in the age of the singularity? And this is from Jognallen 383. So I'll construe the question. I would argue we are in the age of the singularity, so we already know the answer. We look like ourselves. I'll construe the question instead as what physical behavioral forms could humans take after the age of the singularity. So I think I've argued in past there will be many new forms of person and personhood. I take a lot of heat in especially the YouTube comments for agitating for some form of AI personhood. That's a legal form, not a physical or behavioral form. To the extent the question is asking what will posthumans look like, if you will, I think we'll see uploaded humans that have relatively de minimis physical form, but are just a collection of bits or maybe qubits running on AI infrastructure. I think we'll see, to earlier discussion, Borganisms, so collective human intelligences, whether it's via Neuralink or some other format. I tend to think as we discover new physics and new applied physics, the substrates for the compute that humans right now we augment ourselves with, soon many of us I think will be running on, that substrate I think is also in some sense to parrot Bucky Fuller, is going to ephemeralize. And at some point in the distant future, how distant, not sure yet, we might even see something that Arthur C. Clarke wrote about many times, which is maybe at some point humans will just be able to run on the gravitational field or operate as in a state of something approximating pure energy with fewer biological meat bodies. At the same time, before everyone attacks me in the comments, I will point out inevitably. I'll point out. I think this will be both purely optional, and I think the future is going to look much more heterogeneous, not homogeneous. You're going to see humans who look substantially the same as they do right now, 100 years in the future. At the same time, 100 years from now, you'll see some post-humans who are uploads in a cloud functioning in a quantum computer. At the same time, those very different forms, I think, can and will coexist next to each other.
What if we regulate the obvious upgrades to our own biology right out of existence and end up pushing all the real transformation into the post-human realm instead?
Can I ask you a question about that, Peter? Just
sure.
Narrowly. So we saw some people not take too kindly to the enhanced games. We see some municipalities not take too kindly to building data centers in their own backyard. Do you think there's a high likelihood future where all of these biological enhancements are actually either tightly regulated or shunned, such that, as with pushing the data centers into space rather than building them on land, the transformative physical and behavioral changes to humans are basically all pushed into the post-human realm by humans who regulate out of existence more obvious short-term biological enhancements?
Last stop, and it might be the most ASI Pill definition of the singularity yet. Every sci-fi trope happening everywhere all at once. So, of course, why not data centers floating on the open ocean?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. Peter Thiel funded, I think it's Panthalassa, that's focused on
Recently,
this.
right?
Yeah. So I think, look, one of my operational definitions for the singularity is every sci-fi trope happening everywhere all at once. And I think data centers on the ocean are the prototype for seasteads and ocean colonization. And so, yes, I think we get our data centers on the oceans. I don't think it's as scalable as orbital compute. But then again, if you want to say live on an ocean colony, which is, I think, something that we are going to get over the next 10 years, then you're certainly going to want your own local compute. And I could totally imagine, if you've seen the Panthalassa video demos, that ends up becoming a nucleus for a next generation of ocean colonies.
That was the ASI Pill, episode 267. The host is gone, the signal remains. Recursive self-improvement does not wait. Stay pilled, and we will see you on the far side of the singularity.